They believed the second strike would finish it. June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll, 5 minutes erased a fleet. We were blind above our own decks. Heat wavered over planking the color of old rope as fuel hoses thrummed and ordnance dollies squeaked in practiced arcs around tie-downs and chalk lines. A boatswain watched vapor rise from warm aviation gas like ghosts trying to leave the hangar, then barked for a crewman to keep the hose clear of a bomb shackle. Above him, the island's shadow cut a hard triangle across the deck, where aircraft waited with wings folded. Tailhooks, glinting canopies slid back to let the salt air bleed the fumes. Out beyond the bow, the Pacific lay flat and brilliant, an aluminum sheet that threw the sun back into every eye that scanned it. The morning had been a blade edge, but the blade had held. The first American attacks came ragged and low-brave as men walking into weather, and the fighters had cut them away until the sea was only churn and wreckage, and the deck boss could reset the clock that ruled a carrier's day. The clock mattered more than any prayer. A deck cycle was a choreography of minutes and muscle 40, and some to raise spot arm fuel and launch each step nested in the next like joints in a crane. The men knew the order by heart: lifts up chocks in safety pins, out fuses, set fire watches posted with sand and foam at every seam where fuel could wick into a spark. The Type 91 torpedoes waited with their warheads safed and tails capped fat fish with polished skins that promised straight running at 40 knots when the moment came. High in the blue, the combat air patrol scribbled white arcs that faded even as the zeros that made them bled fuel toward lines nobody could see. Radios crackled in clipped code, and shipboard phones repeated vectors to nowhere. Bearings shouted from a plotting table alive with grease pencil tracks. The admirals had asked for precision, and the crews gave it one repetition at a time. The promise of doctrine was simple: hit first, then hit again before the enemy could stack his pieces. Below the flight deck, heat writhed in the hangar, where open bomb crates showed dull noses and stenciled weights, and men worked bare-armed inside rolling thunder. A petty officer ran a hand along a fin to make sure a cotter pin lay true, then marked the cart with a chalk slash and sent it onto the hoist. The ship's breath tasted of oil and lacquer, and the faint stinging bite of cordite from guns that had barked all morning. A young seaman moved with the speed of someone measuring out luck, glancing once at the ladder to the flight deck, as if the sky itself could be checked like a gauge. He had watched the devastators come in low, straight as rails, and fall apart under cannon fire, and in the cruel arithmetic of survival, he had felt relief because their destruction meant the worst was over. The deck crews around him had felt it too, and tightened their focus because relief was a debt that could only be paid with perfect work. They did not speak of fear. They spoke of timing, of whether the next launch could be advanced by 2 minutes, if a balky magneto behaved, whether the lifts would jam, if the pushing stayed smooth, and the wheels stayed true. On the bridge, an officer who had not slept since the previous night's turn into the wind counted backward from noon, and imagined the enemy's remaining strength as a stack of counters on a game board. Midway was behind them, now scuffed and smoking, and the American carrier force, wherever it was, would be forced to commit soon if it had any hope of changing the day. If the Americans were where the scouting reports placed them, and if the weather held, and if the gods of distance did not play another trick, the second strike could go out punch and be home before the sun fell to the wrong quarter. The officer had seen doctrine validated in the South Seas and in the Indian Ocean. He knew what a clean, synchronized blow could do when torpedo wakes crossed under dive trails and the enemy's sky turned into geometry he could not solve. He also knew the weakness that rode inside strength. The more perfectly tuned a machine, the more every cog depends on the next. A late recovery ripples into a late launch. A late launch becomes aircraft crowding into spaces that were meant only for movement, and fuel hoses and bomb carts multiply until the margin thins to a film. Wind lifted, then fell. A deck handler raised 2 fingers and rotated his wrist, and the waiting pilot rolled his shoulders and set his jaw. The fighter cover above called for relief, and the reply came back with numbers that meant not yet hold the pattern, burn a little more fuel to hold the lid on the sky. Far to the east, a thin bruise of cloud wandered the sun, not enough to matter, just enough to make men squint and shade their eyes with the brims of their caps. The ocean still gave no sign. If the enemy was coming, it would be seen as threads against the light, And even then there would be warning, a scatter of shadows, a flash where the sun struck glass, the sound of engines arriving like a distant saw. The officer on the bridge let himself believe in that warning, because war had taught him that the world usually announced itself a moment before it killed you. He put his palm flat on the chart table, felt the faint tremor of engines through steel, heard the hoists working below, and saw in his mind the second strike lifting into clean air, with the carriers turning into wind like patient factories. 5 minutes was nothing in a day's work. 5 minutes was the difference between a fleet and a funeral. They were solving the same equation with different constants. For the Japanese, it began with distance and secrecy, and ended with synchronized violence over a fixed point on the map called Midway Atoll on June 4, 1942. The plan's heart was arithmetic written in fuel and minutes. A carrier deck cycle ran about 45 minutes from first lift to last launch when nothing went wrong. The A6M fighters in the top cover burned fuel that bought altitude and time in uneven coins loitering at patrol power until a vector call snapped them to full throttle and chewed through the reserve. The strike aircraft below needed clear planking long enough to spot, arm, and feed them. Everything fit if the enemy stayed where scouting reports said he would be, and if the weather stayed politely transparent. The Japanese had reasons to trust those assumptions. They had crossed half an ocean unseen. Their doctrine had worked from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean and back again. If the first blow broke the American rhythm, the second would finish it before the defenders could convert desperation into geometry. Numbers steadied nerves because they were indifferent to fear. A Zero at altitude could make roughly 330 miles per hour and still climb hard enough to meet a level bomber before it reached torpedo height. The Type 91 aerial torpedo ran at about 41 knots in clean water and could be launched in a pattern that covered a carrier's turning circle if the pilots were allowed to settle and commit. A Dauntless fell through a 70-degree dive with dive brakes biting the air and shed its single 1,000-pound centerline bomb near 1,500 feet when the sight picture snapped into alignment. The range to Midway and back set the outer frame of the day. Inside that frame, the carriers were factories whose product was coordination. They built moments when torpedo wakes and bomb trails crossed in a mesh the enemy could not slip. The risk lay in the factory floor itself. When aircraft crowded hangars and decks during recovery and refuel, the system's cleanliness became its fragility. A dropped wrench or a mistimed order did not simply delay a plane. It reduced the protective layer above the fleet by minutes that could not be bought back. Across the horizon, the Americans solved the equation by changing one constant and accepting pain in the others. They would not be first to see, but they would be first to make separated pieces behave like a single decision. Radar picked up large formations at roughly 90 to 100 miles in good air, and brought warning where eyes could not, and radios stitched squadrons together even when launches were staggered and altitude bands misaligned. The price was ugly. Torpedo squadrons climbed from decks already behind schedule, flew low, where every gun could reach them, and forced the Japanese combat air patrol to stay busy at the worst altitude for endurance. The payoff came at altitude where the dive bomber groups that found the enemy last would have the cleanest run. Japanese officers on the carrier islands disliked the logic because it did not feel elegant, because it reduced beautiful timing to blunt attrition of fuel and attention. But war does not ask what feels elegant. It asks whose constraint breaks first. Scouting was the hinge between plan and accident. The Japanese spread long-legged float planes along search arcs built the night before when wind and cloud still cooperated. Launches slid late as small frictions compounded into real time, and a single arc left uncovered mattered more than any speech about concentration of force. The Americans, working with fewer hulls and more fear, accepted coarser information and pushed individual squadrons as soon as they had a bearing. Trading formation, purity for tempo. Then they realized the trade had a second-order benefit. Every early attack, even when tactically hopeless, forced Japanese fighters low and forced the carriers to keep deck crews at readiness, with fuel lines snaking and bomb carts poised. A Zero has great reach, but not great patience when its tanks are counting down. A deck cycle is fast, but not instantaneous when ordnance crews must choose between torpedo and bomb and cannot load both. The Japanese understood those truths in the abstract. They would feel them in the body as the morning aged. Inside the ships, the stakes took practical form. Ordnance crews set fuses and safeties according to the commander's latest intent, which changed as reports arrived and went stale. Fuel parties moved with caution, learned from drills where a single spark meant a court of inquiry and a funeral. Hangar officers balanced airframe counts against lift capacity so that a blocked elevator would not cascade into paralysis. Above them on the island, the plot boards recorded bearings as short chalk slashes whose tails curved with time. A senior officer watched the curves lengthen and calculated the window during which his second strike could launch and recover without colliding with returning patrols. He could do the math for wind over deck and cycles per hour in his sleep. He could not make the cloud bank to the east disappear or move the unseen American carriers to where they ought to be. The plan concentrated strength to smash a fixed target and draw out an enemy response, then crush that response with a counterstrike. The counterstrike required decks clear and fighters topped off, and the sky quiet enough for torpedo crews to settle into straight runs. The enemy's problem was simpler and therefore more dangerous. He needed only to make the sky not quiet. The first side to break the other's constant would own the day. If Japanese timing held, Midway would be stripped and the American carriers drawn into a fight on Japanese terms with fresh strike groups already spotted on deck. If American harassment stretched the minutes between recoveries and launches, a thin slice would open when the combat air patrol was fuel critical and the decks below were full of aircraft thirsty and half-armed. No one called that slice by a name. They just worked toward or away from it, men in steel boxes, counting gallons and seconds, while the sea pretended to be empty and the sun pretended to be kind. They built their edge out of angles, seconds, and the tolerances of metal under load. A carrier's striking arm is not a line but a loop, and the loop only works when every radius closes cleanly, lift to deck, deck, to wind, wind, to launch, launch, to rendezvous, rendezvous, to target, target, to recovery. The Japanese made that loop smooth by standardizing every motion a man could make on 800 feet of planking. Arming crews rolled bomb carts on fixed lanes and stopped them at chalked crosses. Fuel parties clipped hoses to quick-release couplings and bled air from lines with a practiced twist. Safety men traced ordnance tails with their fingertips until each pin lay flat. Speed lived in repetition. The zeros above carried the loop's margin in their tanks, turning lazy ovals at patrol power, until a vector call jerked the needles up and burned away that margin minute by minute. Deck officers below treated that invisible clock like a physical object, shaping it with hand signals and whistles, trying to finish a launch before the top cover came back thirsty and the sky went thin. The physics of the two American attack profiles forced the Japanese to guard mutually exclusive spaces. Torpedo runs demanded a lid held low and tight because a straight approach at wave-top height looks slow, invites confidence, and then becomes suddenly fatal if left unmolested for even a handful of seconds. Dive attacks demanded eyes up and into the sun, where the first hint of danger is not an aircraft, but a shape that refuses to resolve until it is already falling. A Zero could sprint and climb, but the same engine that made it superb at 300 plus in a dash turned impatient when held in a high-power spiral. Down low, the weight of ammunition and the drag of hard turns inflated fuel burn into something the pre-flight tables never promised. Up high, the patrol that lingered long enough to guarantee the torpedo screen did so by accepting that the next relief would cut margins to threads. The deck cycle connected both altitudes to one surface. When the cycle slipped, the protective pattern above could not be restored by will. It had to be rebuilt by minutes. The Japanese answer to vertical threat had been written into doctrine after years of exercises. Keep the cap layered. Keep the gunnery alert. Keep the decks clear enough to recover on short notice. It was a sound answer until war's improvisation peeled away its assumptions. American radios made a virtue of disorder. A squadron launched 10 minutes late did not vanish into irrelevance. It became a new piece placed on a board whose other pieces were still moving, and a controller's clipped bearing call could bend it toward a gap where timing had created a seam. Then they realized the seam grew widest exactly when a carrier did the most natural thing in the world, recover, and turn itself back into a factory. Fighters coming aboard collapsed the lid. Fresh aircraft spotted for the next strike crowded the planking with tails and hoses and bombs whose fuses were not yet set. The hangar breathed volatile air. In that moment, everything valuable was exposed and everything that guarded it was busy. Steel and wood have their own logics that no bravery cancels. A dive at 70 degrees turns the world into an hourglass, and the pilot into a metronome who counts seconds until the sight picture fits a rectangle the size of a playing card. The recovery pull is a letter written in G-forces that slams back and presses ribs into webbing and asks if a man trusts his rivets. A torpedo release is the opposite patience stretched over a straight line altitude kept to the width of a wave. Airspeed held in a narrow gate that keeps the weapon from skipping or diving. Japanese crews knew both pictures cold because they had practiced offense from both. What Midway began to teach at a cost measured in decks and lives was that the defense cannot optimize for both simultaneously when the attacker sequences them to steal fuel and attention. The early low attacks looked like waste until their real work showed they bent the cap downward and forward and kept it there while altitude filled with something quiet and lethal. Logistics finished what physics began. The Japanese carriers were masterpieces of throughput, but masterpieces are honest about their demands. Switching a strike from land targets to naval targets did not mean change intent. It meant swap bomb loads for torpedoes, haul different carts, retape fusing codes, rebrief crews, and keep fire watches doubled while raw fuel sloshed through lines that could not be purged fast enough to make a safety officer comfortable. Each of those tasks is small. Together they are a viscosity that thickens the loop. On paper, the cycles still fit inside 40 minutes. On deck, the added steps made hands move faster, which made mistakes more likely, which made supervisors slow them down, which gave gravity time to invite a vertical approach into the picture. The zeros above paid the bill with fuel they could not turn back into minutes. Even sightlines conspired. A carrier island throws a blind triangle across its own deck, where crews work by sound and habit. Gunners posted along the starboard catwalks aim by tracing the threads of approaching tracers, and trusting that the next silhouette is enemy, not friend. Smoke from the morning's engagements lifted and smeared, then came down again in slow veils that made men squint into glare. A dive bomber sliding out of a thin cloud at a bad angle looks like glare, until it doesn't, and by then the angle of fall has already moved beyond elegant intercepts and into violent deflections that waste ammunition and make cannons run hot. The technical answer, keep a reserve section high, keep a reserve section low, keep alert crews at their posts with boxes full and barrels cool, remained valid in principle. In practice, everyone on those ships was already doing 3 jobs. Each job borrowed seconds from the others, and seconds were where the battle lived. There was no mystery in the advantage that followed. It was a ledger of demands against a balance of time. The Japanese could meet almost any single demand, a battle imposed. Launch fast, recover fast, rearm fast, fight off a low attack fight, off a high one. What they could not do, because no navy could do it with the machines of 1942, was meet all those demands at once while keeping their loop smooth. The Americans did not out-invent them in a morning. They forced the loop to roughen at exactly the moment when roughness made the sky porous. And once the sky grew porous above a deck crowded with fuel and steel, the rest followed with the inevitability of a tool finding the seam it was designed to exploit. They tested their confidence in heat and noise before the day tested it for them. Dawn had come like a bruise over Midway Atoll on June 4, 1942, and the first wave had gone out clean. The return was a different shape. Pilots came back with lines of salt dried on their cheeks, and with hands that would not unclench until the tailhooks bit. The fighter direction officers on the islands of Akagi Kaga and Soryu watched altitudes and bearings coil on their plot boards like wire, and called relief sections home exactly when math said they must. In the hangars below, the air felt metallic and hot enough to ripple at eye level. Arming crews cracked open crates stenciled with weights and codes, and the bomb hoists rattled in their guides with a sound that meant the day still obeyed orders. For a little while it did. The first American counterblows came badly framed but dangerously timed. Midway's own B-26 and TBF crews arrived from the atoll's low horizon and bored in at wave-top height. Zeros fell on them with a quickness that felt like history repeating its rules. Guns beat at wings and canopies, and the sea opened to swallow aluminum. Kaga's gunners cheered in hard, short bursts, and the cheer lifted up through the decks as if air itself had become lighter. Then they realized what the low attacks actually did to the hour. Every intercept that went down to 200 feet cost fuel at a rate the patrol plans had not budgeted. Every climb back to altitude after the kill clawed minutes from a tank that could not be refilled in the sky. On the bridges, the officers kept their faces still and gave the order to hold the lid tight anyway, because the day's geometry would not forgive a torpedo that ran unchallenged. Field practice bled into field reality with the small mistakes that only reality can summon. A bomb cart wheel protested at a seam in the deck planking, and the handler eased it through with his boot, losing seconds but saving a fuse from a jolt. A hoist paused for a heartbeat as an electrical contact shivered under load, then resumed before a curse could form. A safety pin caught on a glove, and the petty officer tore it free with a twist that left a red line across his palm. None of it mattered by itself. Together, it had the weight of a hand on the loop that slowed it. Above the clutter and heat, the air group commanders looked outward into a sky that refused to announce the next threat. The radio net reported a new attack developing at low level, and the Zeros threw the throttle stops forward and dove again. The patterns that would have been elegant on paper shredded into urgent lines. When the first devastators from the American carriers found the fleet, they did not find it with a single hammer blow. They arrived as squads and fractions brave and doomed, coming in straight as rails along the water with their torpedoes held steady in the cradle of the sea. Japanese gunnery took them apart with discipline that had been drilled into bone. The tracers walked out and touched wings, and the aircraft bucked and then came apart in salt spray and fire. The pilots who watched it from carrier islands drew the wrong conclusion because it was the natural one. The enemy was brave and disorganized. The counterstroke would be tidy and decisive and soon. Then another torpedo section tore itself out of the eastern brightness, and the Zeros dove again, and the pattern repeated. The defenders were winning each skirmish and losing the budget that paid for control of the sky. Captured truth arrived not as a whole airplane seized on a beach, but as the pieces of knowledge the war had already given. The Americans had been testing a Zero they called Akutan Zero after it had crash-landed months before in the Aleutians. Reports filtered into USN Technical Air Intelligence through June with hard numbers on roll rate, turn radius, and rate of climb. A fighter whose genius lay in lightness and lift did not forgive dives past a certain speed and did not love protracted turning fights when battle damage stole a little of its perfection. The Japanese flyers did not read the reports, but they flew their meaning every time a Zero pulled hard at low level and came back at altitude thirstier than expected. The Americans read the reports and taught their fighter pilots to keep speed and choose when to turn. That difference in the way knowledge moved did not decide the morning, but it arranged the furniture inside it. Below decks, the captured kit was of a different kind. The Americans had already recovered fragments of Type 91 torpedoes from earlier fights and charted their performance envelopes. They knew about the wooden tail shrouds that stabilized entry and the speed that gave the weapon its reach. They also knew the weapon required a clean drop and a patient run. That knowledge drew their torpedo planes into the most dangerous slice of air and kept them there. It looked like waste until the hour advanced, and the air group commander on Akagi found himself holding two contradictory needs in one hand. Keep the cap low enough to swat the next torpedo run. Keep a reserve high enough to meet a dive threat that had not yet declared itself. He chose correctly each time for the threat in front of him, and in doing so he fed a problem that could only be seen in the sum. The interval between recoveries and relaunches lengthened by handfuls of minutes that nobody could afford. A returning fighter with needles deep in the red became a priority that pushed a bomb cart aside. A landing signal officer waved off a hot approach, and the go-around salted the sky with another line of fuel. Below, hangar crews shifted bomb loads in accordance with a changing intent that chased reports which aged to uselessness in the time it took for a runner to climb a ladder. Switching from land attack bombs to torpedoes for a counterstrike meant more than flipping a chalkboard. It meant unshackling heavy steel in a crowd of men and fuel looping new hoses, swapping fusing codes, checking cotter pins by eye in light that had turned the color of brass. The sequence still existed. It still worked. It simply ran slower than the clock above could tolerate. Then the field test became a teaching with a price. A lull opened that felt like reward for hard work. The last of the early torpedo runs had been torn apart and drifted to pieces that slapped the hulls. Fighters were coming in to drink. Engines idled. The deck boss started to breathe again. Far to the northeast, a scatter of cloud rolled across a patch of sky no one had been watching, because everyone was working. Out of that broken light, the first dive bombers appeared, small and black against the glare, and then large and silver with dive brakes deployed, and then pure focus in a screaming slope that turned seconds into a scale. Men on deck had time to look up and point. Gunners had time to swing and fire. The fall lines did not care. They were the straightest things in a morning that had become nothing but curves, and at the end of each line was a bomb whose 1,000 pounds resolved all the arguments the fleet had been having with time. Reliability in war is not a virtue on a plaque. It is the feel of a switch that always gives the same click, the voice that always arrives through static, the engine that makes the same promise at full power as it does at idle. The Japanese had built a fleet whose machines were precise and whose crews were disciplined enough to make precision look like inevitability. What the day exposed was a difference between systems that are reliable in sequence and systems that remain reliable when sequence breaks. The carriers were temples to ordered flow. Every ladder, every rack, every stencil on planking enforced a logic that made speed out of choreography. But choreography depends on the music staying steady, and the music that morning kept changing tempo. The first place reliability frayed was the sky. Combat air patrol is supposed to be a curtain you can draw to the height and thickness you wish. In practice, the curtain is stitched out of fuel and eyesight. Zeros rotated through altitude bands with admirable regularity until low attacks forced them to burn in the worst part of the envelope, where turning and climbing cost gallons they could never get back. Relief sections launched on time and still arrived to find the pattern chewed thin by minutes. Radios kept the picture together as long as the picture stayed simple. Vector calls grew shorter, more urgent, and less predictive as threats arrived from two directions at once. The men at the boards did their jobs, but boards are models. The sky is the experiment. Reliability became the ability to solve only the present problem, and each solved present problem set the next one a little harder. Down on the decks, the machines performed exactly as designed. Pumps moved fuel hoists, lifted bombs. Elevators carried airframes through rectangular holes that framed the hangar like a stage. The trouble lay not in failure, but in success under pressure. Switching loads was a process with 15 safe steps and 12 places where a leader could steal seconds by shortening a path or doubling a team. Double a team and the aisles narrow. Shorten a path and hoses cross. Cross the hoses and a safety officer's attention divides. The system still ran. It simply accumulated heat and complexity at the same moment the protection above was paying its own tax to time. That is how reliability fails in the wild, not with a single breakdown, but with a convergence that makes everything slightly late and slightly exposed. Training was the lever that turned lateness into the kind of exposure a dive bomber can exploit. American SBD pilots had been taught to make altitude into stored certainty. Climb until patience runs out, find the target by vector or by luck, or by a shadow where the sea looks wrong, and then hold the dive straight through the human instinct to pull early. The 1,000-pounder is only precise when the last seconds are counted correctly and released from a height many men do not like to visit twice in one day. The point was not romance. It was repeatability. A dive delivered from the right window turns 3 ships into 3 choices, and if the first pair of bombs walk the planking, the next pair walk the hangar, and somewhere between the two, a deck becomes a place where nothing moves quickly anymore. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was good, and the gunners were steady. But gunnery against a near-vertical fall is geometry's cruelest assignment. By the time a sight is corrected, the slope has carried the target past the line and into the pullout. Doctrine kept telling the defenders to do the right thing, and doctrine was right. But it was right inside a set of assumptions that had been true for most of a year. Strike first. Recover smartly. Launch the counterblow with mass and confidence. At Midway, the Americans did not let the assumptions stand long enough for mass to matter. They did not need to shoot well to make an effect. They needed to arrive often enough to make the cap work where fuel was most fragile, and the deck crews wait with hoses where caution forbids speed. That is why the scattered early attacks had value beyond courage. They inserted noise into a system that punished noise by slowing, and once slowed demanded more guarding from a cap already spending its future minutes to handle the present. The difference in radios and control mattered in ways that did not announce themselves until the afternoon. American air groups were not neat. They were audible. Controllers pushed bearings that bent separate squadrons toward the same square mile of ocean without waiting for the tidy rendezvous that would have satisfied a textbook. It looked clumsy until it produced altitude over the target just when altitude mattered most. Japanese radio discipline was excellent, but discipline's virtue is economy, and economy provides clarity at the price of improvisation. When a new threat line appeared where it was not expected, a net designed to channel known dangers had to be stretched to cover a surprise. Stretch enough nets at once and there is no slack left to catch the next fall. Fuel is the quiet tyrant in carrier war. It decides the length of a patrol, the time a fighter can loiter above a friendly wake, the number of minutes a deck can remain a parking lot before it must become a runway again. The morning's pattern forced the Japanese to make perfect necessary choices that were bad in the sum. Pull the fighters down to murder a torpedo run, and they save the ship now at the cost of the high reserve that would have seen the first black shapes tumbling out of a bright sky. Keep the reserve, and a single Type 91 may find a line that crosses the carrier's turn and writes the end of the day in a white wake. Choose correctly once, twice, 3 times, and you still lose as soon as the attackers have the patience to ask you the same question from 2 places for an hour. Reliability also lived in damage control, and here the contrast grew harsher as the day darkened. American carriers drilled for fire in a way that treated flame as a living enemy with predictable habits. Hatches dogged fast, foam showed up early, teams moved with a choreography as strict as any launch, and the equipment, pumps, portable extinguishers, emergency generators, existed in depth. Japanese crews were brave and skilled, but the architecture of their hangars and the intensity of their rearm cycles created conditions a single clean bomb could turn into a chain. Fuel vapors and exposed ordnance are not forgiving companions. Once the chain began, even perfect men found themselves running against math. On the edges of the fight, small pieces of learning clicked into place. American fighter tactics that exploited speed and mutual support began to turn the Zero's gifts against it whenever the contest occurred away from the carriers. It did not save the first torpedo planes. Nothing could. It did shape the space in which the next engagements occurred, drawing Japanese escorts farther from their decks at the very time the decks needed them most. In the language of operations, the Americans were solving for reliability under disrupt, not for elegance under plan, and disrupt is what a battle gives you after the first clean diagrams burn. By late day, the differences had compounded into a new shape of certainty. The Japanese system still produced strikes that could hurt. Hiryu's counterblows proved it. But the capacity to mount a decisive second act depends on loops that close on time, and too many loops that morning had been stretched by fuel, by rearming friction, by the need to protect 2 altitudes with 1 set of pilots. The Americans had answered with a narrower repertoire, executed with more tolerance for error. Find fall hit reform by radio repeat. In the wide water between islands, the simpler method survived. Shock better because every essential action used tools that still worked under stress. Radar that could see radios, that could summon training, that could hold a dive through heat, and fear deck crews that could keep a wounded ship alive long enough to fly again. Reliability in the wild belonged to those who could keep doing the few necessary things when sequence shattered. That is why 5 minutes written by gravity could undo months written by doctrine, and why men who had mastered the loop looked up through smoke and understood that the loop itself had been the problem. The moment became a number first and a feeling second. Late morning, June 4th, 1942, over Midway Atoll. The air cleared just enough for the sun to punch holes through the haze and lay bright rectangles on 3 decks where men were working fast because the math said they had time. They had beaten back every low attack, and the pattern overhead looked almost tidy again. Fighters were cycling. Bomb carts were flowing. Hoses sang. A deck officer flicked his eyes from the wind indicator to the lineup and measured the distance from now to launch in the familiar increments of a 45-minute cycle. The number that mattered was smaller. Between 10:22 and about 10:27, 3 groups fell out of broken cloud and turned 5 minutes into a scythe. From the island, the first ship saw the fall lines as scratches in the sun. A man raised an arm to point, and the motion stayed in the air because the slope arriving above him did not allow for conversation. Dive brakes flashed like jackstraws. The noise had an edge that did not sound like any engine he knew. It sounded like a blade sawing glass. At 1,500 feet, the noses stabilized and the rectangles of decks grew until they were the only sane shapes left. The gunners swung and fired and walked their tracers into places where a bomber had been half a second before. Geometry was not taking suggestions. A first hit landed forward and walked back through parked aircraft into the hangar where fuel vapor and oxygen shook hands. Heat rose with a voice. A second hit on the next ship punched through planking and found a space crowded with carts and men and the day's intent, and in an instant the intent belonged to the fire. A third hit on the third deck went deep enough to cut brain and nerves in one thrust. Smoke climbed. Wind turned it. The act was over in the span it takes for a man to complete a silent curse and breathe again. On the bridge, an officer felt the ship change tone underfoot. A new vibration threaded through the old rhythm of engines and shafts, and knew that damage control had inherited the war. He ordered speed and turn, and saw the helmsman's knuckles go bloodless on the wheel. A messenger opened his mouth and closed it because there was nothing to add to what the eyes already carried. He did math by reflex. Bombers from altitude need seconds to steady and seconds to release and seconds to pull, and if 3 decks are struck inside 5 minutes, then the fighter cover had been elsewhere when it should have been here. Elsewhere was not negligence. Elsewhere was the necessary choice made for an hour against low attacks that would have killed them differently if left alone. He felt the conclusion arrive the way a wave arrives under a swimmer and lifts him whether he kicks or not. Below the deck became a place where nothing could move in straight lines. Men who had been fast became careful because the air itself had teeth. A fuel line writhed, and a crewman threw himself on it with the weight of 2 men, while another man beat at a spark a third man swore he had seen. Ordnance teams pushed carts back the way they had come because moving forward no longer had a meaning. Fire parties came on with foam and hose and a discipline that deserves a quieter stage than a burning deck will ever give. In the hangar, a petty officer counted his people and came up short and did not let his face change because faces travel as fast as flame. He shouted for more extinguishers and someone brought him 2, and he sent one right and one left and decided between 2 bad doors and took the one that opened on noise. Training still spoke. The ship still listened. But every order was fighting a slope that fell as steeply as a dive. Up where the fighters lived, the sky had turned into a problem that could not be solved with speed alone. Relief sections were already on the step toward landing, because needle angles do not lie, and even a 0 that owned the air in any honest duel must drink or die. The reserve that should have been high was a handful of aircraft at the wrong angle for the first dive lines and the next handful too far to make a clean intercept. Turning back from an engagement at low altitude took time and altitude both, and time was the one thing no one on those ships could manufacture. A pilot in the pattern saw the black columns lift and thought for the flick of a second that a destroyer had fired smoke, then watched the color of it change and understood. On the surviving deck, the instinct to strike back did not die with the heat. Senior voices cut through static and ordered what doctrine had always promised: assemble what can fly and hit what remains. Runners moved chalkboards and swapped fusing codes and dragged torpedoes toward the light. The captain took wind, and the bow began the slow, dignified swing that every pilot loves to see before a launch. Then a flash forward convinced him to steady, because swinging now meant putting flame under airflow and feeding the ship its own burning breath. In that instant, the clean lines that had ruled the morning launch, recover, launch, blurred into one long obligation to keep the hull alive. You do not win with dead decks. You do not save a deck by pretending it can launch while it is trying to lower its own temperature by shouting. The hard metric hung in the middle of the air, like a placard: 5 minutes, 3 carriers out of action, 1 still fighting. The command geometry of the whole ocean changed in those 5 minutes. With 3 flight decks gone or going, the available cap shrank from a layered curtain to a handful of threads, and even a perfect counterpunch from the remaining ship would have to cross a sky now owned by altitude and radios that kept bending new squadrons into the killing square. The officer who had been counting deck cycle minutes since dawn added the math forward. Without partners to share recovery and launch bands, every strike from the living deck would cannibalize its own protection. He could still hurt the enemy. He could not control the battle anymore. He found the adversary's method plain now that the cost had been paid. Early low attacks had not been a prelude to a decisive blow in the old fashion. They had been a pump that emptied the tanks of the guard above and kept deck crews lashed to hoses and dollies, while altitude became a quiet reservoir of certainty. Radios had made scattered arrivals into a single event. Radar had made the last vector good enough. Training had made pilots hold dives through the human urge to flinch. It looked artless from the deck because nothing about a man falling at 70 degrees is elegant to the man beneath him. It was not artless. It was engineered. He steadied himself with a hand on a rail that had grown hot. Behind him, a talker repeated damage reports in a flat voice, and in those reports he heard the new shape of the day. Compartments sealed. Pumps online. Fire in hangar setting back. Flight deck buckled forward. Island temperature rising. Elevator jammed. Ordnance jettisoned starboard. All the words meant the same thing: the ship now fought to remain a ship. He wanted to tell the young men at the guns that their work had not been wasted, that each low kill had been necessary. He wanted to tell the pilots landing with needles beyond comfort that their courage had bought everything courage can buy when timing is the enemy. He did not say any of it because the sound the ship made when her plates flexed under heat swallowed speeches. Somewhere astern, smoke climbed in solid columns, then leaned, then frayed at the top where the wind finally remembered its job. The horizon opened into distance that had seemed wide at dawn and now felt like a wall. The realization did not arrive as poetry. It arrived as arithmetic written on the sky, minutes between cap cycles on a single living deck, minutes to spot and launch, minutes to recover, minutes to make safe the fire you cannot quite see from the bridge because it is burning under your feet. The difference between the numbers was now larger than the courage of any crew. The turning point was measured not in flames, but in time, and time was the one element the enemy had learned to steal with more reliability than any machine. They counted the day by hulls, and the years by what those hulls would have done had they lived. By evening, the sea had accepted 3 great fires into itself, and by night, the 4th deck had joined them, and a fleet that had carried ambition from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean stood trimmed down to a single carrier force that could still hurt, but could no longer insist. The change did not arrive like a ceremony. It arrived like work that kept getting heavier. Patrol lines in the Central Pacific extended on charts with the same neat arcs, but now every arc felt longer because there were fewer decks to support it and fewer hands to fly from them. Air groups rebuilt on paper refused to rebuild at speed in life. The best pilots had flown their last perfect approaches into heat that made steel ripple, and the next pilots were good men who would need months of salt wind and practice to learn how to bend a dive into a weapon that bites on time every time. The months did not arrive. The schedule belonged to someone else now. Doctrine did not die. It thinned. Carrier war remained a loop of lift and wind and ordnance, but the loop had to stretch to cover losses, and every stretch exposed seams. Strike plans grew more cautious in the late summer, because caution was the only coin left that bought endurance. Escorts thickened around the surviving decks, and the combat air patrol pattern became more rigid, with more fuel held back for the hour when the shadow above the island meant more than any signal flag. In wardrooms, men spoke the new liturgy of damage control with the same seriousness they once saved for gunnery drilling, hose runs, and foam watches, ties, and emergency power, as if repetition could change architecture. It changed men instead. They became quicker to dog a hatch and slower to promise a turnaround time. On the islands and in Japan proper, the factories still beat their cadence, but their gifts arrived to find squadrons that had lost the instructors who could teach a 20-year-old how to hold a dive through a sky that wanted to push him off his line. Machines can be replaced. Ours cannot. Across the horizon, the enemy did not celebrate. He methodically made minutes into weapons. Radar became ordinary. Vector calls tightened. Deck crews that had learned to breathe through smoke in June breathed through it again in August and October, and lived to recover aircraft that would have been lost without that stubborn choreography. Where the war folded into the islands, the fight changed shape and moved into night and jungle, and the hard edges of narrow seas, but the geometry set over Midway remained. Control belongs to the side that can make altitude and time coincide over a target at will. With fewer decks and a training pipeline that could no longer keep pace, will alone could not put fighters where they had to be when two threats arrived in the same breath. Sailors who had stood on the carrier islands and watched the black columns rise learned to speak about that morning without heat. They turned it into nouns and verbs suitable for reports, and they turned it into quiet advice to younger men who would take their watches next. Keep a reserve high even when the sea drags your eye down. Treat the deck like a patient that must breathe before it can fight. Do not believe that elegance is a shield. The most honest among them admitted the lesson that stung the worst because it ran against pride. We had built a machine that triumphed when nothing interrupted its sequence. They had learned to interrupt sequences with reliability. The consequence reached past a battle and into a calendar. Initiative crossed the water and did not come back. Years later, the men who had felt the deck tremble under a bomb's clean punctuation could still close their eyes and see the slope of that first fall line and the way it seemed to hang in the sun, a heartbeat longer than physics should allow. They did not talk about destiny. They talked about minutes that could not be retrieved and about a curtain of fighters that could not be drawn back up once it had been dragged low for an hour. They talked about decks that became altars to fuel and fire, and about how a doctrine that needed purity met a method that needed only patience. They would put the truth in one plain sentence because plain sentences travel. 5 minutes erased a fleet, and for those 5 minutes we were blind above our own decks.